Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to make a web API. So from Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new project, and this will be a ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to call it Metal Store. And I'm going to go ahead and add it to source control and make a local Git repository. And we're going to make a 2.1 MVC application. You can use either API, web application, or MVC to create, or even empty, to create a web API. These three options will have the libraries already loaded to create a web API, so it's a little easier. And I'm going to set my authentication for individual user accounts and click OK. So I'm going to go ahead and build this solution. And once it successfully builds, I'm going to hit Control F5 and see if we get a good website. And it appears we do. And so the next step is to build our web API. And to start that, I'm under models, I'm going to add a model class. And we're going to imagine that, let's say this metal store that we're building this website for has, when they do sheet metal work, they have these cut off pieces of sheet metal that they then want to sell. And they're going to sell them to different companies that, and those companies are just going to link into their, link to them using the web API rather than having an interface for it. And so to do that, we'll make this class called cutoffs. And what a cutoff is basically a piece of sheet metal that's been cut off from a typical 4x8 sheet or 4x10 sheet that's not being used and is available for sale. And so we're going to provide this cutoff an ID field, this class called cutoff an ID field. And these are pieces of sheet metal that have a width. So probably a float or a double. We'll use a double. For width. Length. And then thickness. And then we'll use a decimal value to store the price. So once we have our model, then what we're going to do is, of course, go to our application DB context. And at the class level, we're going to add a DB set of cutoff called cutoffs. We're of course going to have to add a reference to our models folder, which I'm going to clicking control dot, which will bring up easy fix options here. Using metalstore.models, we'll add this using directive, which gives me access to this class here in the models folder. Now that we have a DB set, this is a good opportunity to via our NuGet package manager add a migration. And then update database. We can look at our SQL Server Object Explorer and see if that actually updated in the development database that Visual Studio gives you. And let's see if I will let that run. And then we'll find our database here. And we'll see if the table was created. And in point of fact, we can see our table was created down here. So, and if I expand that, we can see that it created our values. So once we have that, then the next step is to make our API. At this stage, we're going to go to our controllers folder and we're going to add an API controller. So we'll add controller. And you notice that because we made a MVC project, we have options for MVC scaffolding as well as API scaffolding. So I'm going to pick API controller with actions using Entity Framework. That will scaffold everything. And I'm going to pick my model class, which in this case will be the cutoff. And then the data context will be the application DB context, which is the default one we get with our project. And the name that we have here is important because when this will be what your path will look like when someone goes to the URL for your API. So cutoffs is probably good, and so I'm going to click add. And so now we have our controller, and it has a it scaffolds up most of what we need to work with a API. One thing to note is that this API is fully open, so right now anyone can come in through the web and edit your database. So normally you'll want to put more authentication authorization controls on this, or delete the controllers which allow someone to insert, update, or delete your data. If you just want this to be a way for another site to get your data, you would just provide get cutoffs and get cutoff, and that would allow someone to access your data, which you would probably take all of these, the put, the post, and the delete. You would add either an authorization attribute to those, or you would just delete them, and that would prevent someone from being able to use your API to modify your data. And there are different use cases which govern how you would do that. So, for example, if this is just being used to provide access to your data from another system, you just deleting them would probably make the most sense, would probably be the most secure. If, on the other hand, you're going to use your API and you're going to provide maybe a SPA, a single page application to edit, then you would probably set authentication and authorization attributes for those methods. Always make sure that you control the API at this level in the controller, not just at the user interface level. So we're going to leave this up for this demo though for now. And once we have this, I'm just going to hit Control F5 and build it and run it. And you'll see that we basically already have a API. And if you look here, you can see API and then the route is API and controller. So if I'm going to use this get cutoffs, I would put API and cutoffs. You can see they even give you the URL there. And if I run that, right now it's empty because we don't have any data in there. So I'm going to set up my startup so that it will initialize some data into this application. So I have a little workflow I created for myself for seeding databases in .NET. And we're going to start off by going to the configure services method of the startup class. And here where we have add DB context, we can make sure that we have a DB context service that's added to the services object. And then we're going to add a seed method to our startup. And you could put this in a different class. I'm just going to put it in right up above my startup. And since we're going to make this method so that we will pass it in the service provider, we'll be able to use that to get our application DB context. We'll put a guard on here to make sure that our context is not null. And I'm going to create a list of cutoffs. Again, I'm going to have to add a using directive for metalstore.models. And then in here, I can initialize this list. So I'll just initialize a few of them. And we'll put in a few of these just to get started, just so we have some data to work with. Oh, you know, I forgot to put in price. So there we have just a list just for some starting data. Now you normally probably would be doing this unless you're just doing this for testing, which is what we're using it for. Normally your user would be inputting this data. And then once we'll iterate through these and we'll add them to our context. First, we'll check to see if it's there. We don't want this to be added each time. Fortunately, we don't have a unique ID for this to work very well, so maybe what we'll do is we'll just run this for now just to test it. Actually, we should be able to do this. We'll set ID equal to and then we'll check if so we'll check to make sure that this ID field doesn't exist. If it already exists, then if it doesn't exist, then we'll add it. If it doesn't exist, then we should be okay. We'll see if that creates a problem. It might, but we'll give it a try. So I'm going to hit Control F5. Oh, I didn't call my method. So in addition, I need to call this method, and we're going to call it from the configure method of of startup, and we're going to need to add a parameter to our configure method so we can inject the iService provider. So we're injecting a service provider into our configure method because we're going to then use that down below here after we do everything else. We're going to call our C database method and pass in this service provider that we had in MVC inject, and we'll wait for it. So in addition to what we had before, we also needed to do this. Since I'm using an ID field, and since that's an automatically generated ID field in the database, that's how MVC does this by default, then that means that the database will want to generate this number. And if I just ran this code as is, we'll get an error. What we need to do is also execute this command: set identity insert to on, and then after we're done, set identity insert to off. And dbo.cutoffs is basically the name of our table. And what we're saying is we're going to suspend the identity insert aspect of our table while we're seeding it, so that we can put in the ID fields that we want, and so that we can do this check here. So I'm going to set these to on and off, and now when I run this, what we'll see is if I go to my database, and I view the data, now it's seeded my database, and if I go to my web API, we can see we now get our API with our API call goes to our controller, and it just goes to the context and returns cutoffs. And what ends up happening is that it will be delivered as a JSON object. So you can see this is a list of JSON objects, a collection of JSON objects and what's important is to notice how it renders the field names. They're all lowercase in this case. They all are made to start with a lowercase. If you have a compound word, the second word I think will be capitalized, and then the values are being presented as numbers. We also have a second form of our get, which is where we have an ID field, and we should just be able to put, say, 2, and if we just put a slash and then a number, we will get that index. I put /3, I get the third one, I get the one at index 3, and so we can get both all of them and individual ones. So that concludes making the API portion of this presentation. And so to review, basically make a model, add it to your DB context, and then just scaffold up an API controller. And once you scaffold that up, it will do all the hard work for you. Thank you very much.